Okay, so on today's video podcast, at least for a legislative geek like me, it's kind of fun as I've made my way through about half the states that publish their bill drafting manual. The other half, like California, do not. I've read about some terms used in these other states, and in most instances, we have a comparable term, but there are a few with some interesting distinctions. So, what are they? Here's a handful I came across. So, California calls it a sunset date or a repeal when a statute obviously is being repealed or terminated. Hawaii calls it a drop dead clause. North Dakota calls it a repealer clause. Washington State calls it an expiration date clause. And Louisiana calls it either the expiration clause or a termination clause. California also calls it an urgency clause when a statute takes effect immediately. New Mexico calls it an emergency clause. Colorado calls it a safety clause. California refers to existing law as current law. Louisiana calls it present law. California has a special statute designation rather than a general statute. Colorado calls these special statutes their declarations of special factors. In California, we refer to it as a gut and amend bill, where the new contents are placed into an existing bill and replace the current context. Hawaii calls it a gut and replace bill. New Mexico calls it a substitute bill. South Dakota calls it a hog house bill. Kentucky calls a variation of a gut and amend a piggyback amendment. Minnesota calls it a delete everything amendment. And Colorado calls it an SEBEC amendment. And SEBEC stands for strike everything below the enacting clause. In California, we call the author of a bill the bill author. Most other states and the federal government call them bill sponsors. Um, California says that we are adding a new law. North Dakota calls it a creating clause that adds new law. California generally refers to it as a reporting provision when a law is required to be studied and reported back to the legislature. Colorado calls it an accountability clause. In California, we call it the Legislative Council's Digest, where a summary of a bill is provided. South Dakota calls it the catch line. Illinois calls it an ABR. An ABR stands for abbreviated synopsis of a bill. And Louisiana calls it an abstract. California calls it a section heading, where it describes the particular code section's topic. Minnesota calls it a head note. In California, like in many states, we have a single subject rule when a bill can only include one major subject or topic in that bill. Washington State calls it the one subject rule. And other states like Texas and Colorado, among others, also call it the one subject rule. California calls it a companion bill when the same bill is introduced in both houses, which rarely happens in California. It's much more common at the federal government level and in some states. In Kentucky, they call it the same as bill. California sometimes in their bills includes a legislative intent statement when a bill contains one or more statements of intent. Minnesota, on the other hand, calls this an interpretation clause. Uh, we call it a trailer bill, a bill that trails the state budget bill and makes statutory changes to implement the budget. Illinois calls things a trailer bill, but a trailer bill is when one bill amends another earlier passed bill in the same session that hasn't taken effect yet. California has a couple of types of bills, four to be exact, that are not subject to the people's power of a referendum. Colorado has something similar, but they call it inserting a safety clause, and that safety clause can preclude any type of bill from being subject to the people's power of referendum in Colorado. So just a handful for legislative geeks of different nomenclature that's used to describe similar provisions of a bill.